Welcome to your screencast where we will discuss the structures of the spinal cord and its associated structures. The illustrations you'll see throughout this screencast comes from Seeley's A&P textbook, University of Michigan's Blue Link, Netter's Atlas of Anatomy, and other various anatomy textbooks and atli. We'll first start off with the spinal cord. When we take a look at the spinal cord, it is segmented into a cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions. These regions give rise to 31 pairs of spinal nerves, meaning that we have the spinal cord levels on both sides. Although we have the spinal cord in one elongated section, there are some changes in diameter throughout the length. First, in the cervical region, we see an enlargement due to supply to the upper limbs, which we can see in this region over here. And we also have the region more inferior, which is termed the lumbosacral enlargement. You will also have this described as the lumbar enlargement. It is still referring to the same segment of the spinal cord. So let's take a look at this as far as the different regions or segments. Here we have the cervical segment, and remember that this is an enlargement. We have our thoracic segment, which you see starting at rib number 1 and extending almost down to about 10th rib. And then more inferiorly, we have the lumbar segment, which spans pretty much from the regions where you would find ribs number 11 and 12. And and I forgot to mention that we have the sacral region, which is going to be almost at the very tip where we would expect to find the conus medullaris. So together here, the lumbar and sacral segments are the enlargement, the lumbosacral enlargement of the spinal cord. And lastly, we have the coccygeal segment, which is the very inferior portion of the spinal cord. Here's what you can expect for it to look like on a cadaver. We can see more superiorly is the cervical enlargement of the spinal cord, and then inferiorly, where you see it enlarged right before we see the conus medullaris, which I'll describe to you in just a moment, is your lumbosacral enlargement. Here's an inferior portion of the spinal cord that we see right in this region over here. At the very end, we see it coming to a cone shape or a point, and that would be termed your conus medullaris. This conus medullaris structure will be found in the region of L1 or L2. If you find the conus medullaris and look at the very tip of it, you will see a silver or white strand coursing inferiorly, and that is termed the filum terminale. Don't worry if it says internum or externum. That involves more detail. We're just going to know it as the filum terminale. And the other strands that we see surrounding the filum terminale, these are the lower mixed spinal nerves that collectively will be termed the cauda equina. Now, if we were to take that spinal cord and cut through so that we can have a cross section cutting through, and in the transverse plane to be specific, we are able to see the white matter along the periphery and the gray matter internally. And here's the vertebral body. So looking a bit closer here at that spinal cord cross section, if we look at this gray matter in here, we can identify the 3 different horns. The way you can identify whether you are looking at a dorsal horn or a ventral horn is to look for this vertebral body or look for extensions coming out representing your dorsal roots, which lead to your dorsal root ganglion. So once we are able to orientate ourselves, we can see the dorsal horn, where we will find the terminal ends of the sensory neuron. We can also see the lateral horn, which contains cell bodies of your autonomic nervous system motor neurons. and lastly, your ventral horn, which will contain the cell bodies of motor neurons. Beyond the spinal cord region, we can see extensions coming out from this posterior view, which would be your dorsal rootlets. The dorsal rootlets come together to create your dorsal root, which will then lead to your dorsal root ganglion. Remember that your dorsal rootlets and dorsal root contains your sensory neuron, whereas the dorsal root ganglion contains cell bodies of your sensory neurons. If you look on the ventral surface of the spinal cord, we would see that there would be ventral rootlets that are difficult to see here in this view. Those ventral rootlets would come together to create your ventral root, and both of those structures contain motor neurons. Once the ventral root and the dorsal root come together, it creates your mixed spinal nerve. In this image, you can also see the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus, but I don't believe we have any cadavers in the lab that we are able to see this in. Now let's discuss the meninges of the spinal cord. These meninges are going to be the exact same from your brain structure lecture, but we will review them anyway since they will look a little bit different here. So this view is a posterior view of the spinal cord with the dura mater still in place. You can see that it is pigmented a bit more white, and we don't see any of those spinal veins that we saw in the previous images. Here's a bit more of a magnified view. You can see the dura mater here has been cut open, and we could see the cauda equina here. The dura mater in the lab will most likely be pinned laterally. If we cut the dura mater completely away from the spinal cord, we can see the other layers. We know that external to the dura mater, we would have your epidural space. This thick tissue here is your dura mater. So deep to that dura mater, we would have your subdural space, which remember is a potential space. We only have minimal amounts of serous fluid here. And deep to that would be your arachnoid mater, this spider web or saran wrap-like structure. Deep to the arachnoid mater, we would find your subarachnoid space, which would be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And once we peel away this arachnoid mater, we are able to see the pia mater that is adhered to the spinal cord. And just so you're aware, these were the spinal veins that I was referring to in the previous slides. Another thing I want to mention here are these denticulate ligaments. These denticulate ligaments arise in the pia mater and are firmly attached to arachnoid mater and the dura mater at the apex. And what their purpose is to divide the dorsal rootlets from the ventral rootlets. Here's a little bit better look and some more examples of what these denticulate ligaments look like. Denticulate refers to tooth, so anatomists thought this looked like a tooth extending out and attaching to the dura mater.